I come home to find a keypad on my mailbox and my porch missing, just a raw rectangle of screw holes across the siding like teeth pulled out of a smile. Salt wind carries the sound of gulls and the soft thud of ocean on sandbars. A man I barely know is waiting beside my door with a clipboard and a polite cough, the kind of cough people practice when they want power to sound gentle. He is pastor-landlord. He runs the park, chairs the HOA, and preaches on Sundays about prosperity for anyone disciplined enough to tithe on time. He tells me he removed my porch for my safety under Rule 37. Then he nods toward my mailbox and says security upgrades are a blessing, and I should thank the Lord for them. A courier in a windbreaker walks up behind him and hands me a cardboard tube with a county seal sticker. The tube is addressed to me, but it's been signed for by someone else. The wind lifts a flap of blue tape. Inside the clear plastic pouch is a carbon copy receipt with my home's lot number and a time I recognize as the hour I was at a clinic across town getting my blood drawn. I hold the tube like it's an unexploded shell. Pastor-landlord says he can hold my mail at the office until I get settled. Then he points to fresh lumber where my porch used to be. He calls it a temporary platform. It is screwed flush to the door so the door can't open more than an inch. He smiles and tells me to breathe. He says everything that's happening is for my own good. I nod, the slow kind of nod you use when you're counting to 10 in wet gravel. A gull barks, and somewhere a dog tugs a chain against a post. The tube is light in my hands. All of a sudden, I want to see what's inside more than I want to open my front door. I take the tube back to my truck and place it across the seat like a newborn. When I peel the seal and slide out blue paper, I see a title in bold: Affidavit of Fixture Removal. Beneath it is my full name, typed, and a digital signature block with a timestamp that proves I signed this thing while a nurse wrapped a tourniquet around my arm and told me to make a fist. I know those clinic chairs. I know the buzzing soda cooler by the lab window. I did not sign any affidavit while I sat there counting backwards from 100 to keep my fear of needles away from the room. The gulls sound farther off. The ocean sounds closer, like foam crawling into my chest. I hold the paper up to the windshield and talk out loud to the me who always thinks she's overreacting. My voice says one word: no. I did not plan to live out my 60s on a strip of wind between a marsh and the Pacific, but here I am. I worked the cannery for 36 years and learned tides better than calendars. I paid off a 20-year loan on a single wide with an extra room and a slanted porch I built with a neighbor on a weekend when the rain decided to bless us by staying north. My porch faced west. When sunset made it through the fog, the railing turned red like a salmon belly. I kept a tide chart thumbtacked by the door and a string on a nail to tie the morning paper before the wind tossed it. In the hard year, when lockdown pressed the coast flat and sirens felt like a second weather, my granddaughter slept in my spare room with a sequin backpack against her chest and a calendar full of canceled things. We ate soup and watched storm maps. We invented a rule that we would not speak after 9 p.m. about fear. She learned the sound of the cannery whistle in my stories, not in the air. Then the world tried to wobble back to something like walking. She left for a cosmetology course in town. She started dating the fiancé, a boy who sweated optimism and believed the word soon was a tool you could hammer anything with. He carried the heavy end of furniture with both wrists. He called me ma'am, and he called pastor-landlord sir. He wore a ring with a cross on his index finger because he said it reminded him to point the right way. My granddaughter beamed at him like someone who just found a path across river stones that don't wobble. The first itch came from a robot. A voice left on my voicemail said, "Congratulations on your new credit line and thank you for choosing to unlock your home's value."
I pressed the number it gave me and got an overseas air conditioner of a whole tone and a person who used my name. They told me my reverse mortgage pre-qualification looked excellent and they admired my decision to sign electronically. I told them I admired the part of me that could time travel. The person apologized 3 times, then sweetly asked me to confirm just one detail, my temporary forwarding address. I asked them to repeat it. They read out my park's office address and the suite number pastor-landlord likes to put on paper because it makes a single-room office sound like a museum with wings. I thanked the person and hung up before the next 3 apologies. Then I drove to the post office, where the wind always comes in first when you open the door. The clerk pulled up my record and told me there was a hold on my mail and a temporary change of address on file signed by me, dated 2 days after I left for night clinic draw. The clerk showed me the handwriting. It looked like me if you put my hand in a van and drove it down a gravel road while I tried to write. I asked the clerk to print the form. The clerk asked me if I wanted to call a supervisor. I told the clerk I wanted a hard copy and a staple. The clerk slid a printout across the counter with a sigh you reserve for first snow on a Monday. I put the paper in the tube with the blueprints because the tube felt like a boat, and I felt like paper that might drown.
When I came back to the park, the sun shrugged against the edge of a cloud and lost. My temporary platform looked whiter, like bleached bone. Pastor-landlord stood on the gravel with a tape measure and a man I hadn't met who wore a shirt with a hardware store logo. Granddaughter hurried across the lot with a smile that bit its lip at the end. She asked if I liked the improvements. She told me the porch was safer for me and my knees. She said something about the new porch being compliant and modern and clean. The fiancé spoke like he was trying to keep a ball in the air. He said a new porch adds value instantly and creates opportunities. Pastor-landlord murmured the word compliance as if it were a prayer. I looked at the space where my westward steps used to land. It looked like a mouth told to stay shut. The man with the tape measure said we could get the upgrade installed in under 2 weeks if we acted now because materials were already here. I asked who ordered materials. Pastor-landlord said community leadership must anticipate needs. He pulled a packet from a folder and said it would all be clearer after the HOA meeting at 7. HOA meetings in our park happen in the community room that used to be a laundromat before the last owner decided laundry wasn't profitable and carrying wet clothes to town would make us appreciate ownership. There's a bulletin board with faded event flyers and a list of rules that uses more numbers than words. 7 neighbors sat in folding chairs with a space between each chair like a broken comb. The teacher wore a cardigan, even though she always says the heater in this room makes her glow. The nurse kept her hands folded in her lap because if she waves while she speaks, people stare at her rings instead of her words. The baker brought cookies and set them on a table with a paper that says suggested donation. Pastor-landlord took a chair that matched his blazer. He opened with a prayer about stewardship. He closed the prayer with amen and a smile that tried to soften. He read Rule 37 about exterior structures on leased pads. He read it slow. He announced that several non-compliant porches had been designated for temporary platforms until proper engineering could be approved. He looked at me only when he spoke the phrase proper guardianship. People nodded the way people nod when they can't afford not to. I raised my hand and kept it high until he had to give me the floor. I asked who authorized a keypad on my mailbox. He said the office had to protect elder residents from porch pirates and I should be grateful. He said the key code lived with the office and could be updated as part of an overall safety plan. He did not look at the teacher, who muttered that the Constitution had something about mail. The clerk of the county recorder's office was not in the room, but somehow I could feel her breath in that moment, the way paper and public records pretend to be quiet until you put the wrong name on a line. The fiancé stood and said they had taken over my mail temporarily because I had asked for help. He looked at me like a boy who wants a nod so bad he will invent a teacher. I said I did not ask for help, but I appreciated the idea that one day I might. Pastor-landlord smiled and offered words that disguised the sound of a rolling cart. He said families help families. He said wise elders welcome new paths. He said leadership sometimes requires tough decisions to protect people from themselves. I took a breath and emptied it slow. I told him I admired leadership that can fill a room and still leave the door open. He told me my category of questioning belonged under new business. He motioned to a printed agenda that had the words emergency capital improvements underlined in blue. Under that item, he proposed a community-wide porch modernization. He said it would be funded through a special assessment that would be forgiven for anyone who enrolled in a refinance program he had pre-qualified us for through a partner lender he respected. He used the word partner the way people use the word cousin when they are trying to confess and brag at the same time. He said my home was first on the list so I could be an example and a blessing. Granddaughter squeezed the fiancé's hand like a person trying to hold on to a rope after the dock slides away. She said the refinance would give us options as a family. She said my name with a lilt that meant, "Come with me, please. I'm tired of fighting the weather." The teacher asked how any of this squares with manufactured home law. Pastor-landlord said everything was above board and the paperwork was already in motion. Then he said a sentence about my porch that made me understand the blue paper in my tube in a way that made my stomach fold in half. He said, as soon as the fixture was officially removed, we could proceed with title conversions. I am not a lawyer. I am a woman who keeps receipts in plastic bags and knows the sound of a machine that is about to jam. I did not know until that night that some people speak the word fixture the way fishermen speak the word season. The thing about fixtures is that they make a home in the eyes of the county. Remove the fixture and suddenly paperwork can treat your shelter like something with wheels. I held my breath halfway and let it out as a hum so it would not come out as a word no one could forgive. When the meeting closed, I thanked Pastor-landlord for his hospitality and asked him for copies of every form he had used so I could study and be wise and not hold up community improvements. He beamed like a man whose net just bobbed under. He told me he loved a spirit of cooperation. He said his office would have everything ready by morning if I was ready to sign and bless our future. Cooperation is a word that tastes different depending on who puts it in your mouth. I understand cooperation as a dance where no one stomps on anyone's foot hard enough to pretend it was an accident. I left the room smiling like a person who is grateful for an invitation. I waved at my granddaughter and touched the fiancé's elbow and told him he had a strong grip and I hoped he would always use it for lifting, not pushing. Then I drove to the county building where the clerk worked late on Thursdays because that is when people arrive with panic to record deeds before the weekend. The county building is concrete that has learned to pretend it is wood. Fluorescent lights turn evening into a kind of obedience. The clerk looked up from a stack of lien releases and blinked at me like she'd been living under the ocean. She recognized me from a workshop on title nuance the library hosted last winter. She is the kind of person who reads footnotes like novels. She had made a mistake once, she told me during that workshop, by indexing a farm parcel to the wrong name. It took 3 weeks to fix, and a man lost a sale. She had memorized that pain like a psalm. I unrolled the blue paper on her counter. I placed the mail hold form at the corner like a paperweight. I told her my porch was gone. I told her my mailbox was a telephone now. I told her a pastor had picked up a tape measure to measure me. She read the title of the affidavit with her mouth tight. She looked at the timestamp for a long breath. She asked for my phone. I handed it to her. She opened the health portal app I didn't know I had and clicked through to the visit records with the speed of a person who handles only facts, because anything else makes a mess on her desk. She took a screenshot of my lab check-in time and printed it. She lined the printout up with the affidavit. She said words I never want anyone to have to say to me, but I would want to hear them if they are true. She said someone had used my identity in a system that cares more about completed boxes than about the hand that filled them. She said the recorder's office posts daily batches at 5 p.m., and if someone was moving fast, they might try to record transfers late on a Friday so no one could stop them until Monday. She said if any transfer of interest related to my parcel arrived, she could not legally hide it. She could not throw it away. But she could call a judge. She could lay a restraining order across a conveyor belt and make a machine pause like it remembered it was not in charge after all. She whispered that last part in a voice that sounded like someone who still believed her job meant something, even on weeks when meaning sagged and sat on the curb. She told me to bring her any evidence that connected office to act. An IP address, a timestamp, an admission, a pattern of mail interception. She said all this without looking up. Then she looked up and asked if I had eaten dinner. I laughed in a way that scared me. I told her I had cookies in my pocket from the baker. She poured 2 cups of burned coffee and told me to keep the tube somewhere a person with a flashlight could not see it from the road. Evidence turns humans into machines if you let it. Phones, routers, sign-in sheets, the way rain prints on new wood differently than on old. I am not new to the long way around. After the county building, I drove to the city building, where the inspector kept a schedule on the wall with black marker lines that always make me think of the way men measure growth on a doorframe for kids. The inspector is a person who shakes your hand like someone who has decided not to apologize for caring. I showed him a picture of my old porch. I showed him a picture of my new platform. He squinted and made a sound the cannery line used to make when a fish slipped out of the metal curve and clanged on the floor. He said a temporary platform is not a porch. He said electrical work done on a porch without a permit is a fire waiting to announce itself. I asked if he was willing to put a red tag on something at the park where the HOA chair pays for the cookies at city meetings. He stopped looking at pictures and looked at me. He told me code is not politics and neither is fire. He told me he had nightmares about garages that never burned down but glowed long enough to be remembered by every neighbor across 3 winters. He agreed to come to the next HOA meeting as a citizen if I wanted him there. He said as an official, he could do only what complaints and evidence permitted. I thanked him for living in a world where those words still exist. Then I drove home to stare at the rectangle where my steps used to live, and to think about the way eyes learn to look for the line a long time before hands touch it.
The fiancé came by with a cardboard tray. He said granddaughter had made me chili with extra cumin, the way I like. He looked relieved to have something to carry. He asked me to sit on the temporary platform with him and share dinner in the air while we imagined the new views the new porch would bring. I asked him to tell me what he thought a porch was for. He said a porch is for photographs and for making a point to the street about what kind of people live inside. I told him my porch was a book. He said he liked books. I asked him if he had ever read a permit. He laughed a laugh people use when they want to be friends with a question. He said he would never do anything to hurt our family. He said pastor-landlord had worked wonders for other couples, and he would never steer us wrong. He told me a story about a couple who turned a car loan into a wedding, into a starter home, into joy. I told him joy does not like to be used as evidence. He didn't know what to do with that. He spooned chili into his mouth and chewed like a man reviewing a contract he trusted his friend to have read.
That night, the wind came in sideways. Rain threaded the porch screws with bright water that caught the neighbor's floodlight and made the platform glow like a stage. I put the tube under my bed the way I used to slide my purse under there when I lived in an apartment with paper walls. I made tea. I called the nurse. I told her about the voicemail and the mail hold and the affidavit that signed itself while my elbow had a Band-Aid. The nurse is a soft-spoken person whose words cut ropes I do not want to be tied with. She said this is what exploitation looks like at our age now. She said most people think exploitation sounds like a stranger, but the cruel part is the familiar voice that opens the door. She told me to sleep and not to talk, in a way that made me want to talk. I opened the sliding window a crack and listened to a hydrant knock itself happy, and then settle.
The next morning, pastor-landlord called to tell me his office had prepared a time to help me sign. I said I would like to understand the documents by reading every word out loud before anyone put a pen on them. He said not everyone finds legal language easy to read. He offered to summarize. I told him I would start with the titles, and then I would see if my eyes could handle more. He said the easier path is to come by and trust. I said the easier path is how people fall asleep on trains and wake up in the wrong town. He laughed like a man with a good memory for numbers. He told me to come by at 2. He told me granddaughter would be there in case I felt overwhelmed. He said it would be a short process if my heart was surrendered. I said 2 worked. At noon, I took the tube to the small library down by the cannery. The librarian has a postcard of the lighthouse taped above her desk and a jar of short pencils beside the printer. I asked her if I could use a computer, and she waved her hand like she was blessing my right to live. I logged into my email and found 2 notices from an e-sign service that said I had successfully completed steps toward a property upgrade and thanked me for choosing technology. The IP address of the signing session was listed in tiny type at the bottom. I printed the notices and circled the IP address like it was a fish in shallow water. Then I drove to the coffee shop across from the church where the Wi-Fi is named after the youth group. I bought a muffin and asked the kid at the counter if he could tell me what someone could do with an IP address. He told me a story about a time his friend pirated a movie and how the letter came in the mail with a company name he had never heard of. He said IP addresses tell a story about where a computer was when it told another computer yes. I asked if he could help me read the story. He smiled, because teenagers like quests more than they like civics class. He plugged the numbers into a tool on his phone and told me the signing sessions happened on the Park office network. He told me he could not tell me who touched the keyboard. I told him he didn't need to. I bought a second muffin to pretend we were not doing something that blood pressure hates. At 2, I walked into the Park office with my tube in my hand and my face arranged like a person trying to be agreeable. The office smelled like lemon cleaner and paper that thinks it has a secret. Granddaughter sat in a chair with her purse on her lap. She squeezed it so hard, the little gold ring on the zipper left a print on her finger. She stood and hugged me like a child who wants to be the person she sees in her head and does not know how to be that in front of the others. The fiancé sat beside a stack of forms, like a student who volunteered to pass out tests, because then he might know the answers first. Pastor-landlord stepped out from the back room with a pen already clicked. He set down 3 stacks of paper and a notary stamp, like a man setting a table. He thanked me for being a team player. He said, "The sooner we get through these, the sooner we can give you the peace you deserve."
I laid my own papers out, starting with the printouts from the e-sign service and the mail hold form and the clinic timestamp. I put the tube on the desk and slid out the blue affidavit. I told him I would begin by reading titles in order. He nodded like a man who knows a test he has already passed with someone else. I read, Affidavit of fixture removal, authorization for mail handling, durable power of attorney. I stopped. I looked at him the way you look at a child who has a frog in his pocket and calls it a surprise. He said the attorney form would make my life easier. He said I would never again need to drive across town to sign a thing. He said my granddaughter could handle everything in my name. He said my signature would be a blessing she could carry in her wallet. I told him blessings do not usually require stamps with my name on them that I do not control. He told me I was being dramatic. He told me when he was a boy, his grandmother trusted him with the keys to the pantry, and that trust built a man. I told him I never met his grandmother, and I do not live in his pantry.
Granddaughter put her hand on my arm. Her hand shook the way she used to shake the first minutes after she woke from a nap when she was a toddler and did not know which world she was in. She whispered that she just wanted to help. She whispered the word college loan. She whispered the word car repair. The fiancé looked at me with a grin like a dog waiting for a treat it believes it has already earned. He said this would position the family for the future. He said it in a voice men use when they want to impress each other by sounding like a commercial. Pastor-landlord pointed to a line on a form and told me to sign there and initial here because I am in good hands. I have not been young for a long time. I do not owe anyone the drama of my past decisions, but I will say this. The first time a man told me to sign quickly for my own good, I learned to picture a door behind me. I learned to feel the doorknob with my mind. I learned to count the steps it would take to get that knob in my hand. I smiled and told him he was right. Then I asked for a glass of water because reading out loud makes my throat dry. He nodded at the fiancé. The fiancé went to the back sink. When the room lost him, I reached into my pocket and clicked record on my phone and set it face down on top of the tube. I asked pastor-landlord if he could walk me through the necessity of a power of attorney for a porch. He smiled and said words I will not put here because they were a weave of God and paperwork I do not ever want to see used as a blanket again. I asked him if I could take the forms to the clerk to let the county bless our path. He told me that was not necessary. I asked him to explain why my signature had appeared on an e-sign log while my blood was being labeled in a clinic on the south side. He paused. The room changed temperature without moving air. He told me technology is imperfect, and the path of the righteous does not get hung up on glitches. He reached for the blue paper like a man reaching for his wallet when the check comes, and he intends to appear noble. I move my hand first and tap the tube with my knuckles. I picked up my phone and pressed stop, and I said I would like to move this conversation to a room with a table big enough to hold what we have here. He asked me what I meant. I told him I wanted to have this exact talk at the HOA meeting with witnesses and cookies. The fiancé came back with water filled too high. A little sloshed onto the desk. It made the notary stamp shine. That night, I made 3 calls. I called the inspector and asked him to come to the meeting as a citizen with eyes, and if his eyes saw anything that broke a code he loved, to be ready to love it out loud. I called the clerk and asked her if she would be at her desk Friday at 4:50 p.m., shoes off, ready to run if needed. She laughed, and I heard a sound in her laugh that told me she had been waiting for a moment like the one I was offering, not because she wanted trouble, but because she wanted to use tools she didn't get to touch often. I called the nurse, the teacher, and the baker and asked them to sit in the front row. I asked them to bring pens with working ink and to ask questions when the room forgot why questions exist. I slept with a tube under my pillow and dreamed of salmon running against a machine and not caring. Friday came in slow and gray. Fog hung just above eye level, refusing to move even when a truck rolled through with timber and a radio loud enough to break a morning. At noon, I watched a man in a vest unload decking from a flatbed in front of my home, as if the future were a box with tape across its mouth waiting for a blade. I walked right up and asked him for a receipt. He looked surprised to be asked for anything. He said he was instructed to deliver against a plan. I asked to see the plan. He showed me a printed page with the park letterhead and the phrase, "Modernization Pilot." I took a photo. I asked to see a permit. He said the permit would be pulled after installation because this was a routine park improvement. I told him that was like washing dishes after you eat and claiming you cooked. He looked down and then nodded. He said if anyone asked, he would say he was just the driver, and his mother taught him not to step where a woman told him there was a hole.
At 6:50 p.m., the community room was full in the way only rooms get full when people sense that fog is about to move. Pastor-landlord arranged the chairs himself. He put granddaughter and the fiancé in the second row with a clear line to the front. He wore a tie the color of a checkbook. The inspector slipped in with a baseball cap and sat at the edge of the third row with his arms crossed. The clerk did not come. The clerk stayed in her building where alarms sound like the inside of a refrigerator. The nurse sat with the teacher and the baker. They passed a napkin back and forth like a flag. I took a seat in the front beside an empty chair. I set the tube across my lap. When the room quieted, I asked if my family could have that empty chair. Pastor-landlord said of course. He glanced at the door. I looked at my phone. 2 minutes had passed. I had already been recording. Pastor-landlord began with a prayer that turned into a lecture about fear. He asked for a spirit of submission to wisdom. He opened the agenda and slid a new item to the top. He proposed a vote to prioritize porch modernizations for vulnerable residents. He used the word vulnerable as if it had volunteered. He moved to add the refinance program to the agenda. I raised my hand. He closed his binder without calling on me. The inspector lifted his chin. The baker coughed in the form of my name. Pastor-landlord reluctantly recognized me. I thanked him for caring for vulnerability in our community. I said before we voted to bless any modernizations or finance anything, we needed to bless the law that makes meetings honest. I read aloud from a printout of the state's open meetings requirements. I said an agenda must be posted in advance. I said adding items that bind people to financial obligations without notice is a quick way to wake up to a headline no one wants. He smiled and said we had always been a family here and families move nimble. I told him families also leave the door unlocked in case someone is running late. He said my metaphors confuse people. I said confusion is the wall mold grows on. At 6:50 p.m., the community room was full in the way only rooms get full when people sense that fog is about to move. Pastor-landlord arranged the chairs himself. He put granddaughter and the fiancé in the second row with a clear line to the front. He wore a tie the color of a checkbook. The inspector slipped in with a baseball cap and sat at the edge of the third row with his arms crossed. The clerk did not come. The clerk stayed in her building where alarms sound like the inside of a refrigerator. The nurse sat with the teacher and the baker. They passed a napkin back and forth like a flag. I took a seat in the front beside an empty chair. I set the tube across my lap. When the room quieted, I asked if my family could have that empty chair. Pastor-landlord said of course. He glanced at the door. I looked at my phone. 2 minutes had passed. I had already been recording.
Pastor-landlord began with a prayer that turned into a lecture about fear. He asked for a spirit of submission to wisdom. He opened the agenda and slid a new item to the top. He proposed a vote to prioritize porch modernizations for vulnerable residents. He used the word vulnerable as if it had volunteered. He moved to add the refinance program to the agenda. I raised my hand. He closed his binder without calling on me. The inspector lifted his chin. The baker coughed in the form of my name. Pastor-landlord reluctantly recognized me. I thanked him for caring for vulnerability in our community. I said before we voted to bless any modernizations or finance anything, we needed to bless the law that makes meetings honest. I read aloud from a printout of the state's open meetings requirements. I said an agenda must be posted in advance. I said adding items that bind people to financial obligations without notice is a quick way to wake up to a headline no one wants. He smiled and said we had always been a family here and families move nimble. I told him families also leave the door unlocked in case someone is running late. He said my metaphors confuse people. I said confusion is the wall mold grows on. Granddaughter stood and asked to speak. Her voice wobbled and settled, and then sounded like the voice of a person taking off her shoes before she steps on clean floors. She said she wanted me safe. She said she wanted me to feel beautiful on a new porch. She said she wanted the park to look like all the pictures she shows her friends. She showed us all a little vision board on her phone, filled with railings that could hold a wedding. I watched the fiancé watch her. He stared like he was trying to decide which future would give him the most points. He put his hand on her knee in a way that said he hoped this would all be over soon. I told the room I had a simple story to share before anyone voted. I held up the tube. I removed the blue affidavit and said I did not sign it. I held up the mail hold form and said I did not request it. I held up the e-sign logs that said I signed from the park office network while a nurse tightened a band around my arm across town. I named the clinic. People in the room knew it. The nurse raised her hand and confirmed that lab draws log times down to the minute because billing likes exactness when they knock. The inspector sat up. He asked if he could see the tube. I handed it to him, and he pulled out his glasses like a man pulling a truth out of his pocket. He pointed to a line on the affidavit that said the fixture was removed as of a certain date, and that removal would allow a title action to proceed. He asked if the porch removal had a permit. Pastor-landlord said park management had authority to remove unsafe structures. The inspector asked to see an inspection report that proved my porch was unsafe. Pastor-landlord said we don't need red tape to keep people from falling. The inspector took a breath and let it go. He told the room he had driven by earlier and observed unpermitted electrical work on the temporary platform. He said the wires were stapled without guards and the access clearance didn't meet code. He said this as gently as if he were telling us all we had spinach in our teeth. He pulled a red tag from his pocket. He asked if the platform was within park jurisdiction or city jurisdiction. Pastor-landlord said the city should not meddle. The inspector said the fire department does not ask permission to spray water. A murmur ran through the room like small fish near pilings. The teacher opened a copy of the park bylaws and read Rule 37. She asked whether it allowed staff to intercept mail or file affidavits on behalf of residents without notarized consent. Pastor-landlord said those documents were for convenience and could be revoked if anyone found them upsetting. He shrugged like a man solving a riddle he wrote himself. I held up my phone and pressed play. The room heard his voice from 2 days ago explaining why a power of attorney would be a blessing to carry in a wallet. The room heard the part where he told me glitches happen and faith means signing anyway. The room went very still. The fiancé blinked hard and looked down because sometimes sound is more painful than sight. It would have been enough to end there and trust the slow passage of paper to finish the meal. But slow justice is a bridge that can drop your wheels if you take your foot off the gas at the wrong time.
I asked the inspector if he would mind stepping outside for a minute to check on a wiring condition I had noticed on my platform. He said gladly. I asked the nurse to come too because witnesses save everyone trouble. I asked the teacher to text the clerk the moment we left the room and tell her to check the incoming queue for anything with my parcel number on it. The baker stood up and announced cookies to keep people's mood from turning into gasoline. We stepped outside into the kind of gray that makes streetlights look thoughtful. The inspector crouched under my platform and made a soft noise. He took a picture with his phone. He stapled a red tag to the edge of the new wood. He wrote the word "stop work" without hesitating. He called the number on the contractor's printout and left a message in a voice that could turn a river. He keyed up a report for the city system and a copy to the fire department. The nurse took video with her phone while she narrated calmly like a person in a nature documentary who knows the bear won't climb into the boat if everyone stays smart.
When we walked back into the room, the fiancé was standing at the front, breathing like a runner. He said this had gone too far. He said he had a deed transfer envelope and he was taking it to the county himself because this was America and a man has a right to file paper. Pastor-landlord nodded and told him to go. Granddaughter reached for his sleeve and said his name as if it were a fragile plate. He shook her off gently and said, "This is how you build a life." He headed for the door. I held up my phone like a conductor holds up a hand. I said to the room, not to him, that anyone rushing to the county office at 7:40 p.m. on a Friday night to record a transfer might be disappointed by a closed door. The teacher smiled into her sleeve. I added that the batch would not roll until 5 p.m. next business day, and if anyone wanted to learn how that process worked, the clerk would be happy to explain, given she had just received a text and decided to be on call Monday. The fiancé looked around like a person on a dock looking for a ferry he was sure he heard. He left anyway. Sometimes the only way to learn about a door is to push on it. We stayed. The inspector wrote down a list of changes the platform would need to qualify for a permit. He wrote in neat block letters as if he were making a sign anyone could read. The nurse took my arm and squeezed it once. The teacher stood and read a paragraph from a state consumer law pamphlet she carries in her tote because she has been to more than one funeral where someone praised a woman's patience when what they meant was her exhaustion. She read the part about undue influence and the way trust can be weaponized. Pastor-landlord said none of this was necessary and we were wasting the good spirit of the night. He said I was tired. He said this stress could harm me. He said stress is a killer. He said I should come to his office and rest and sign in quiet. Something about the way he said quiet broke something open in Granddaughter. She stood, dizzy, and then steadied herself by looking at the clock on the wall and counting to 5 out loud. She confessed that she and the fiancé had met with the pastor privately for weeks. She said he told her that he had a plan to help us all. She said he told her that old paper is a curse and new digital paper is a blessing. She said he promised to get us a new porch for free if I signed easy things. She said he told her I was stubborn and that a good granddaughter knows when to be firm. No one moved. The baker stood and said that a person can say something forgiving and true at the same time. She said we forgive the girl who wants to help when she has no money. We do not forgive the man who collects her fear and calls the pile a plan. Pastor-landlord said this was a personal attack. The inspector said it was an observation. The nurse said observation saves lives. The teacher said truth spoken aloud in a public meeting is a vaccine, not a weapon. Someone snorted. We all got quiet again. The weekend felt like a stuck zipper. The fiancé did not come back that night. Granddaughter stayed at her friend's place and texted me once each morning to ask if I needed anything. I told her to eat breakfast. She sent a photo of toast as if it were proof of faith. On Sunday, the church parking lot filled with trucks. Music leaked out of the building and tried to scare the fog away with volume. I sat in my truck with the tube across my knees and listened to the ocean push a thought up against the land and take it back again.
I thought about how a porch is not a piece of wood. It is a sentence we say to the road. It is a place a person can sit and let a day pass and have the day know it was seen. I thought about how I would like to rebuild mine. I wrote a list in my notebook and titled it Porch Rule 37. Under it, I wrote, "Do not let anyone rename your door." Monday began like cough syrup, sticky and necessary. At 8 a.m., I walked into the county building with the inspector on one side and the teacher on the other because the nurse had a shift and the baker had a delivery. The clerk had already taken off her shoes. She stood behind glass with a stack of forms and a bun that had given up. She greeted us with a nod that meant she knew why we came and would not let us leave without weight in our hands. She told us a packet had arrived in the drop over the weekend. She held it up like a specimen. It bore my parcel number. It contained a transfer of title with a signature that looked like the word yes had fallen down a staircase. It included an affidavit of fixture removal that matched the blue paper from my tube. The notary stamp belonged to a woman who lived in the same building as pastor-landlord's office, if you believed what the internet says on a page most people do not read. The clerk dialed a number with her finger in a way that made me love her hands. She reached a judge's clerk. She explained we needed an emergency hearing for a temporary restraining order to stop recording a potentially fraudulent transfer. She used words the way a carpenter uses shims. She made a crooked thing hold. We waited. The judge took us at 9:30 on a video screen that flickered like patience. The judge listened while the clerk set out the sequence. The judge asked me to speak my name for the record. I did. The judge asked the inspector to confirm his red tag and his observation of unpermitted work. He did. The judge asked the teacher to keep her voice steady while she described the meeting. She did, with a teacher's cadence that made even the judge sit up straighter. The judge asked if anyone had informed the party who sought the file of this hearing. The clerk said she had called the park office twice and left messages. The judge called for a 5-minute recess and told us to sit like people who believe the end of the recess will matter. I used the 5 minutes to text granddaughter and tell her I loved her. She did not reply, which felt honest. When the judge returned, she granted a temporary restraining order to enjoin the recorder from indexing any transfer of my parcel for 7 days, pending investigation. She told the clerk to serve notice to the parties listed on the attempted transfer. She told the inspector to send his report directly to her clerk. She told me to keep breathing. She did not say that last part out loud, but I heard it in her tone and scratched it under Porch Rule 37 in my notebook anyway. The clerk printed the order and slid it under the glass with a hiss. Paper can sound like rain if you let it. She asked if we wanted a deputy to serve it or if we had a plan. The inspector asked to be the one to carry it because he liked the idea of delivering something that might stop fire before it started. The clerk smiled like a person remembering a mistake and feeling it leave her shoulders. The fiancé walked into the county building at 4:47 p.m. with a manila envelope and a grin he had ironed. He headed for the counter with the purpose of a football. The clerk stepped forward with her order held flat like a calm sea. She told him his packet could not be recorded and explained why. He flushed the color of someone learning a word in public. He said he had followed instructions. He said he had taken on responsibility. He looked around for pastor-landlord who was not there to step into the moment and turn it into something like a lesson. The clerk slid a copy of the order across to him anyway, so his hand could understand before the rest of him did. A deputy came out from the back like a man protecting a nest. He explained this was official service of an order from a court. The fiancé's mouth made a few shapes and then closed. He left the building with both his hands empty. I watched from the bench by the window. The bench smelt like every lunch anyone ever ate there. My chest felt like a tide chart, mines rising and falling in little squares. The time read 5:58. The clerk exhaled in a way anyone could hear. She sat down in her chair like a person who had earned it. The investigation that followed did not need my adjectives. A detective with a middle name he refused to share interviewed the notary who stamped forms for the park. The notary forgot things in an order that looked like a pattern. The e-sign logs with the IP address painted a picture the coffee shop kid could read. The post office printed more pages. The clinic printed mine. The inspector filed his report with photographs so respectful of the truth that even a liar would have to call them honest. The judge extended the restraining order into a preliminary injunction with terms that made anyone who wanted to touch my parcel sign a page that asked them if they were sure. The Attorney General's office took an interest in how many affidavits of fixture removal had moved through our park after storms and before refinances. Pastor-landlord retired from chairing the HOA to spend more time with his family. The church appointed an interim leader who turned down a raise. The fiancé met with a public defender and then met with another one. He cried once in a hallway and then asked the clerk if she had ever done anything right after doing something wrong. She nodded. He asked her, how? She told him it involved staplers.
Granddaughter came to my home on a Tuesday morning with wind in her hair and a letter in her hand. She said she had spoken to the detective. She said she had told the truth about the way she had been coached to talk to me. She said she was ready to sign a statement about who encouraged her to sign for my mail when I was not there. She said she would testify in a little room where people use microphones. She said she hoped I would not stop loving her. I told her I did not plan to stop learning how to love her better. She exhaled and made the sound babies make when you lift them from a car seat after a long drive. She sat with me on my temporary platform with our backs against the door that would not open. We looked at the space where a porch needed to be. She asked me if I would let her help rebuild. I said everyone who lifts must first know which end of a board is heavier when the wind pulls. Consequences came the way consequences do on the coast. Slower than angry people want and faster than people who are hiding behind paperwork expect. A prosecutor who chose flats over heels filed charges that included identity theft, attempted recording of a fraudulent instrument, and elder exploitation. A licensing board asked the church to explain some things about money and counsel. The Park LLC put itself up for sale when a buyer from out of state decided cash flowed better in states where nobody knows your first name. The neighbors formed a committee called Option C because Option A always feels too obvious and Option B feels like compromise you will regret in a year. Option C meant a resident co-op. It meant a lawyer with a gray ponytail who knows the word capitalization table and likes explaining it to people who never thought they would need to say it. It meant a loan from a foundation that had a picture of a person digging on its homepage. It meant the nurse and the teacher and the baker and I attending Zoom meetings where we said our names slowly to strangers who said they were on our side and then proved it by asking nothing but good questions. It meant my granddaughter sitting next to me, coloring in the margins of a handout, while the fiancé sent an apology text I did not read right away. The day the co-op closed, the fog made room for a strip of sky that embarrassed everyone with its blue. We signed at a folding table. The clerk from the county came at lunch and cried for a second like a person who remembered a farm. The inspector brought donuts from the shop that fries everything in oil that tastes like memory. The teacher wore a t-shirt with a lighthouse on it because she is not afraid of being literal in public. The nurse hugged everyone exactly once, with enough pressure to be felt. The baker set a sheet cake on the counter with frosting that said, "We own the ground under our feet," in letters that leaned a little to the right because joy does not always stand up straight. A news photographer asked us to pose on my platform, and I said no thank you, because next week this will be a porch again, and I would like that captured instead. He nodded and took a picture of my hands holding a tide chart instead.
We built the new porch with a permit taped to the window in a plastic sleeve like a medal. The inspector came by 3 times, not because he did not trust us, but because he wanted to see a thing done well from beginning to end. Granddaughter measured twice and cut once. She watched videos at night with a woman who builds things in a desert, and she brought the knowledge into our wet air and made it work by paying attention to details. She learned to sink a screw without stripping the head. She learned to pre-drill. She learned to keep her hair out of her eyes with a bandana instead of her hand. She did not ask the fiancé to lift anything. He came by one afternoon with a carton of Gatorade and stood 10 feet off like a dog who knows the leash is not his. He said he got a job with the company that paints stripes on roads. He said putting lines down feels like doing something that will help other people not crash. He said he understood if he could not come to holidays. I said I hoped he would learn how to show up and then do it because that is what holidays are for. He nodded and put the Gatorade on the ground like an offering and left without reaching for a hug I could not accept yet. At dusk, on the day the last rail went up, I carried the tube out and laid it across the steps. I wanted to remind myself a porch can be a courtroom when you need it to be, and a church, and a doctor's office, and a town hall, and a kitchen, and a school. I took out the blue paper and the mail hold and the e-sign logs and the clinic time stamps and the red tag photo and the court order and the co-op closing statement. I laid them like planks on the floor. Granddaughter came out with 2 mugs and put one in my hand and then sat cross-legged with her mug on her knees. We looked at the pile. She asked if I would keep those papers. I said yes, in a drawer near the door, as a reminder that doors useful to me can be dangerous to other people if I do not pay attention. She asked if I would teach her the tide chart. I said the trick is to read the black lines and then look out there and count the breaths between swells and remember the chart is a promise, not a prophecy. She asked if I would write down Porch Rule 37 for her. I wrote, "Do not let anyone rename your door," then added in small letters, "not even fear." The case against pastor-landlord took months. He hired a man who wore a tie that looked like a polished bruise and tried to turn words into smoke. But words will not always obey a pay stub. The notary came clean and asked the court to believe that notary stamps are an instrument that should only be used by people who sleep with their phones off. The fiancé testified that he carried envelopes he never read and smiled at people he did not know because a man he called sir told him that is how you become a provider. The judge listened and then pronounced things in a tone that sounded almost bored, which is more punishing than a shout. Fines came, then probation. A licensing board revoked something that will interrupt prosperity sermons for a while. Plea deals turn people into community service wearing boring vests in front of signs that tell drivers to slow for men with goals. Granddaughter did not ask me to celebrate anyone's sentence. She baked a batch of cookies and took them to the clerk and the inspector instead. I watched her wrap them in plastic wrap on my new porch, her hands moving the way hands move when they remember flour is a better use for a fist. The co-op started little and then got less little. We set rules with more verbs than nouns. We committed to porch inspections before winter because Wynn likes to find excuses. We ran a class called Paperwork is a Tool on Tuesdays in the community room with coffee that did not taste like apology. The teacher drew cartoons about bylaws on a whiteboard, and the nurse told stories about medicine that made fear sit down. The baker organized a porch crawl with cinnamon rolls, and it became an annual event that made the park smell like holidays in July. People began to look forward to the sight of the inspector's truck because it meant we were all on the same side of the line. On clear days, the ocean looks like a ledger, balanced exactly at 0. On most days here, it looks like a hand that cannot decide whether to lift or push. I sit on my porch, and drink tea, while the air threads itself through the slats. A dog 3 units down has learned my name and barks like a greeting. The mailbox door swings and clicks and swings back closed. It is just metal and hinges again, not a statement about who is allowed to hold my life. Granddaughter takes the long route to her shifts at the salon and waves when she passes my lot. Sometimes she stops and brings a handful of samples so I can choose a nail color for Sunday. We sit and put little colored dots on a piece of paper like a map for a person smaller than a thumb. We do not talk about the fiancé unless she wants to, and when she wants to, we use plain words and do not sharpen them. We do not use his name to call him back, but we do not turn our heads away from the place he was. On nights when fog sits like a thought we forgot to finish, I think about the clerk slipping off her shoes behind the glass and calling a judge because a tide chart in her chest told her the next wave might be the one that matters. I think about the inspector sitting through a meeting to watch for the exact moment a red tag saves a day. I think about the nurse keeping her hands still when she could have thrown them in the air and called down a storm. I think about the teacher reading the smallest fonts and making them sound like a song. I think about the baker printing suggested donation and then accepting smiles instead of bills with a grace that would ruin a con if it ever got in the way. I think about how a tube with a county seal can be a weapon and a shield and a story if you are stubborn and lucky and you let your breath turn into a line of small waves you count until you can stand. Someone asked me recently what I learned. I said I learned that the most dangerous sentence in any room is, "This is the easy way." I said the next most dangerous sentence is, "Sign here for your peace." I said I learned that young hands will reach for the heaviest thing in the room if you tell them that thing will make them a future. I said I learned that forgiveness moves like a tide and you cannot force it to arrive on your schedule. I said I learned to love the sound a notary stamp makes when it hits a desk without hitting paper. It is the sound of a tool asking permission. When the co-op elected its first board, they asked me to serve, and I told them I would sit on a committee instead because I prefer work you can see from the road. They put me on the Porch committee. We keep an inventory of rail bolts and boards and cans of paint and colors the coast forgives. Sometimes we rebuild a whole set of steps in a morning and write the word done on a clipboard line that feels like a little parade. Sometimes we show up with a drill and find out what someone actually needed was company while they tried to remember where they put the pink screwdriver their grandmother gave them. We hold the new rules lightly and the old ones gently. We call our list of tips Porch Rule 37, and it is 1 page, not 30. The first line is still, do not let anyone rename your door. The second is, if a man with a clipboard calls you vulnerable, ask him to hold the other end of the board for 5 minutes. The third is, keep a tide chart and a notebook near your mailbox because the ocean and the county both live by schedules, and it helps to have a pen when you need one.
On a blue morning, the year after everything happened, Granddaughter stands on the steps in a graduation robe that costs too much and smiles anyway, because sometimes ceremony is a way to tell your old self you kept a promise. She lets me take 12 photos, even though she hates being still. She leans against the rail we built together and asks if she can read my tide chart. I tell her the numbers and how many inches the moon has in its pocket. She nods like a person memorizing a recipe. The fiancé drives by in a truck with stripes and honks a hello that does not ask anything. We wave without moving our arms. After she leaves for her shift, I sit and look down at the wood and notice the first little nick in the paint on the top step where boots keep landing. I feel the nick with my finger. I do not sand it right away. It is good to keep a reminder where your feet go. Sometimes people drive through our park slow, looking at the way porches line up like sentences. They roll down a window and ask who the contractor was. I tell them we built our own and we are very strict.
They laugh and ask if we are taking new members. I say the wait list is short if they bring cookies and long if they bring clipboards. They smile and drive on. The mailbox door opens and closes with just the right click. The ocean lifts and lowers its shoulder. I sip tea and put my hand on the rail and feel the porch hold. If you are still here, if you followed every line of this and every wave of this, I will tell you the thing I tell myself in the half second before sleep every night. You do not have to get louder to be heard. You have to get clearer. A porch is a promise you make to the street. Make it in words and wood and law and love. And when someone arrives with a smile and a pen and a rule you have not seen before, breathe. Ask to read the title out loud. Find the clerk who will take off her shoes for justice. Find the inspector who has a red tag ready for the thing that will burn without it. Find your neighbors and pass a napkin like a flag. And if you carry a tube with a paper that holds a trap, carry it the way you carry a tide chart. Not like a weapon, like a map.